The morning sun painted golden streaks across the palace windows as Catherine, Duchess of Cambridge, stood before her bedroom mirror. Her hands trembled slightly as she fastened the pearls around her neck, the same ones Princess Diana had worn decades ago. Today was different. Today would mark the end of an era that had defined their lives for over a decade. William sat on the edge of their bed, his military uniform pressed to perfection, yet his shoulders carried the weight of a burden no amount of royal training had prepared him for. The letter from the Palace Council lay open on the nightstand, its formal language unable to soften the blow of what it truly meant. Due to unprecedented constitutional changes and parliamentary decisions, their roles as senior working royals would officially end at midnight. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. They had spent years preparing for greater responsibility, for the day when they would step even further into the spotlight of duty. Instead, they found themselves facing an exit that neither had ever imagined possible. The constitutional crisis that had been brewing for months had finally reached its conclusion, and they were among its casualties. Catherine walked to the window, watching as staff members quietly moved across the grounds below. Many of these people had become like family over the years. Mrs. Henderson, who always remembered to stock William's favorite biscuits. James, the young gardener who had taught their children about butterflies in the palace gardens. Soon these daily interactions would become memories. "Do you remember our first official engagement together?" William's voice broke through her thoughts. She turned to find him holding a framed photograph from their early days, both of them looking nervous but determined outside a children's hospital in Liverpool. "You were terrified," Catherine smiled, though tears gathered in her eyes. "You kept asking me if your tie was straight." "I still ask you that," he replied, standing and moving toward her. Some things never change, but everything was about to change. The morning briefings would stop. The red boxes would no longer arrive. The careful choreography of their public lives, the balance between duty and family, the constant awareness of representing something larger than themselves. All of it would end in a matter of hours. Catherine had always known that royal life came with sacrifices, but she had never imagined that the sacrifice might be royal life itself. When she had married William, she had prepared herself for a lifetime of service, of putting the crown before personal desires. She had learned to smile through exhaustion, to find the right words for grieving families, to carry the hopes and expectations of an entire nation. Now, as she looked at her husband, she saw the boy she had fallen in love with at university, struggling to emerge from beneath the man who had carried the weight of destiny for so long. His eyes held a mixture of grief and something she hadn't seen in years. Possibility. The children were still sleeping down the hall, unaware that their lives were about to transform completely. How do you explain to a child that everything they've known as normal is about to disappear? How do you help them understand that sometimes, even when you try your best, circumstances beyond your control can change everything? William reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers as they had done thousands of times before, but this touch felt different. It felt like an anchor in a storm, like a promise that whatever came next, they would face it together. They had weathered public scrutiny, family tragedies, and the relentless pressure of public life. Now they would weather this too. Outside, the first photographers were already gathering at the palace gates. By evening, the world would be watching their final moments as working royals. But for now, in the quiet of their bedroom, they were simply William and Catherine, a husband and wife facing an uncertain future with nothing but their love for each other and their children to guide them forward. The breakfast table felt heavier than usual, though the same fine china and silver had been set as always. George, Charlotte, and Louis chatted excitedly about their plans for the weekend, completely unaware that their parents' hearts were breaking with each innocent laugh. Catherine watched William spread marmalade on his toast with mechanical precision, his mind clearly elsewhere. "Mummy, will you come to my football match on Saturday?" George asked, his face bright with expectation. "Of course, darling," Catherine replied, her voice steady despite the knowledge that this would be one of the first matches she could attend without a security detail, without careful coordination with multiple departments, without the weight of representing the crown. William's phone buzzed constantly with messages from advisors, family members, and friends who had heard the news through official channels. The palace had managed to keep the decision quiet until this morning, but now the machinery of royal communication was in full motion. Press releases were being prepared, statements crafted and contingency plans activated. "Papa, you look sad," Charlotte observed with the startling perceptiveness that children possess. She climbed onto William's lap, her small hands framing his face. "Are you poorly?" William held his daughter close, breathing in the scent of her shampoo, trying to memorize this moment of pure, uncomplicated love. "No, sweetheart. Papa's just thinking about some grown-up things." After breakfast, while the children played in the nursery with their nanny, William and Catherine walked through the private gardens one last time as the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge. The roses were in full bloom, their fragrance filling the air with sweetness that seemed almost mocking given the circumstances. "I never thought I'd miss the pressure," Catherine admitted, stopping beside the bench where they often sat to review their schedules, the constant awareness that every word, every gesture, every choice mattered to someone, somewhere. "You'll still matter," William said firmly. "We'll both still matter, just differently." They had spent the previous weeks in endless meetings with palace officials, lawyers, and family members, trying to understand exactly what their new reality would look like. There would be no more patronages, no more official engagements, no more carefully orchestrated public appearances. But there would also be no more protocol restrictions, no more having every aspect of their lives scrutinized by constitutional experts, no more walking the tightrope between personal desires and public duty. The irony was that they had both genuinely loved the work. Catherine had found deep fulfillment in her mental health initiatives, her work with young children, her photography projects that highlighted causes close to her heart. William had poured himself into conservation efforts, emergency services support, and homelessness advocacy. These weren't just duties they had performed. They were callings they had embraced. "What will we tell people?" Catherine asked. "When they ask what happened, what will we say?" William was quiet for a long moment, watching a butterfly dance among the lavender. "We'll tell them the truth, that sometimes even when you love something deeply, circumstances change, that endings can be new beginnings, even when you never wanted them to be." As they walked back toward the palace, Catherine noticed details she had never paid attention to before. The way the morning light caught the windows of the staff quarters, the sound of the gardener's quiet conversation as they tended to the flower beds, the familiarity of the security officers' nods as they passed. All of these small elements that had formed the backdrop of their extraordinary, ordinary life would soon become memories. Inside, their private secretary was waiting with a folder of documents that needed their attention. Final signatures, transition arrangements, details about their last official engagement that evening. The business of ending a royal life, it turned out, required nearly as much paperwork as beginning one. "Your Royal Highnesses," the secretary began, then caught himself. Soon those titles would be history too. "William, Catherine, the photographers will be in position at 7 this evening. The route has been cleared and security has been briefed for the final walkabout." Catherine nodded, though part of her wondered what security would look like tomorrow. Would there still be protection officers? Would they need to learn to drive themselves to the grocery store again? Would their children be able to ride bicycles in public parks without causing a media frenzy? As the day progressed, staff members began to quietly say their goodbyes. Some had worked with them for their entire married life. Others had known William since he was a child. Each farewell carried the weight of a relationship that had been both professional and deeply personal. The hardest goodbye came from Mrs. Patterson, the head housekeeper who had helped Catherine navigate the overwhelming early days of royal life. "You've been more than a job to me," the older woman said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You've been a privilege." By afternoon, the reality of what was happening had begun to sink in completely. Tomorrow there would be no morning briefings, no red boxes, no carefully planned schedule stretching months into the future. Tomorrow they would wake up as private citizens, free to make their own choices but stripped of the platform they had used to make a difference in the world. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor that would make their final day even more emotionally charged. Queen Elizabeth arrived without fanfare, something that hadn't happened in years. Her presence in their private sitting room felt both comforting and heartbreaking, a reminder of the long line of duty they were stepping away from. "Granny," William stood immediately, the childhood name slipping out naturally despite the formal circumstances that had shaped their relationship for so many years. The Queen, now in her late 90s, moved slowly but with purpose toward Catherine, taking her hands in her own weathered ones. "My dear girl," she said simply, and in those 3 words, Catherine heard forgiveness, understanding, and love that transcended titles and protocol. They sat together in the room where they had shared countless family moments over the years. Christmas mornings, birthday celebrations, quiet Sunday afternoons when the children played at their great-grandmother's feet. Now it felt like a museum of their former life, each photograph and memento a reminder of what they were leaving behind. "I want you to know," the Queen said, her voice carrying the weight of decades of experience, "that duty comes in many forms. Sometimes the greatest service is knowing when to step aside." William felt tears threaten for the first time that day. His grandmother had been the embodiment of unwavering duty his entire life. To hear her speak of stepping aside as its own form of service felt like absolution he hadn't known he needed. "The constitutional crisis wasn't of your making," she continued. "Parliament's decisions, the public pressure, the political changes, these were forces beyond your control. You have served with dignity and grace, and that service doesn't end today. It simply transforms." Catherine squeezed William's hand as his grandmother spoke. They had both struggled with feelings of failure, wondering if they could have done something differently to prevent this outcome. The Queen's words began to lift that burden of self-blame they had been carrying. "What about the children?" Catherine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How do we help them understand that everything they've known as normal is changing?" The Queen smiled, a rare expression that transformed her face completely. "Children are remarkably resilient, my dear. They adapt to change far better than adults do. What they need is not explanations about constitutional law or political pressures. They need to know that they are loved, that their family is strong, and that change doesn't mean loss of love." As they talked, the children appeared in the doorway, drawn by the unusual gathering of adults in their private space. Louis ran directly to his great-grandmother, climbing onto her lap with the fearlessness of a child who has never known anything but unconditional love from this formidable woman. "Are you staying for tea, Gongon?" Charlotte asked, using her special name for the Queen. "Not today, sweetheart. But perhaps tomorrow you might visit me and we can have a proper tea party in my garden." The simplicity of the invitation struck everyone in the room. Tomorrow, such visits wouldn't require weeks of coordination between multiple royal households. Tomorrow, the children could simply visit their great-grandmother because they wanted to. After the Queen left, William and Catherine spent the remaining afternoon hours doing something they rarely had the luxury of doing. They wandered through their home without agenda or schedule. They rediscovered corners of rooms they had forgotten, found toys the children had left in unexpected places, and talked about memories attached to specific objects and spaces. In William's study, Catherine picked up a paperweight from his desk, a simple glass sphere containing a pressed flower from their wedding bouquet. "Do you remember when your mother gave me this?" she asked. "She said she wanted you to always remember that some moments are so perfect they deserve to be preserved forever," William replied, moving to stand beside her. They both stared at the preserved flower, thinking about preservation and permanence, about the moments that last and the ones that slip away despite our best efforts to hold on to them. Their wedding day felt both like yesterday and like a lifetime ago. The young couple who had promised to love and serve together had learned to do both in ways they never could have imagined. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through their windows, they knew their time for private reflection was nearly over. Soon they would need to dress for their final official appearance, face the cameras and the crowds one last time as working royals. The world would be watching, looking for signs of their emotions, analyzing their every gesture and expression. "Are you ready?" William asked, though he knew neither of them could truly be ready for what was coming. "No," Catherine answered honestly, "but I'm ready to face it with you." Outside their window, they could see the first news vans arriving at the palace gates. By evening, the entire world would be witness to their goodbye. But for now, in the fading light of their final afternoon as the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, they held each other close and gathered strength for the most difficult public appearance of their lives. The car ride to their final engagement felt like traveling through a different world. The familiar streets of London seemed sharper, more vivid, as if Catherine's senses were trying to memorize every detail of this last journey as working royals. Beside her, William sat in contemplative silence, his fingers unconsciously adjusting his cufflinks, a nervous habit she had noticed increase over the past difficult Weeks their destination was the children's hospital where they had made their very first joint appearance as an engaged couple over a decade ago. The symmetry felt intentional, though Catherine knew it was simply coincidence. Sometimes life creates its own poetry, even in endings. "Look," William said softly, pointing out the window as they approached the hospital. "They're all here." The streets were lined with people holding flowers, handmade signs and photographs. Families they had met at various engagements over the years had traveled to be here for their farewell. Catherine recognized faces from hospital visits, school openings, and charity events. Mrs. Thompson, whose son had been treated at this very hospital, stood near the entrance holding a banner that simply read, "Thank you." The crowd wasn't massive, this wasn't a wedding or a jubilee, but it was deeply personal. These were people whose lives had been touched directly by their work, who had experienced firsthand the difference that royal attention could make to important causes. As they stepped out of the car, the familiar sound of camera shutters filled the air, but underneath it was something different. Instead of the usual excited cheering, there was a respectful quiet punctuated by occasional calls of, "We love you," and "Thank you for everything." Inside the hospital, they were greeted by Dr. Matthews, the chief pediatrician who had worked with them on numerous initiatives over the years. Her eyes were bright with emotion as she shook their hands. "Your Royal Highnesses," she began, then paused. "I mean, William, Catherine. This is incredibly difficult to say goodbye to partners who have become friends." They toured the new wing that had been partially funded through one of their charitable initiatives. The bright, cheerful rooms were filled with children who had no idea they were meeting people whose lives were in transition. To these young patients, William and Catherine were simply kind adults who took time to listen to their stories, admire their artwork, and offer encouragement. In the pediatric cancer ward, they met Emma, a 7-year-old girl who had been battling leukemia for 2 years. She had written them a letter months ago, and Catherine had personally responded. Now Emma presented Catherine with a drawing of a princess and a prince surrounded by rainbow-colored hearts. "Are you really a princess?" Emma asked with the directness that only children possess. Catherine knelt down to Emma's eye level, smoothing the little girl's colorful headscarf. "I've been called that, sweetheart, but what's more important is that you're the bravest princess I know. Will I still be able to write to you?" Emma asked. "Always," Catherine promised, and in that moment she realized that some connections transcend official roles. Her correspondence with this brave little girl wouldn't end because her title was changing. In the hospital's therapy garden, they encountered journalists who had followed their work for years. Instead of the usual formal interview setup, this felt more like a conversation among people who had shared a long journey together. "How are you feeling about tomorrow?" asked Sarah Mitchell, a reporter who had covered their first engagement and was now covering their last. William and Catherine exchanged a glance before William answered. "Grateful," he said simply. "Grateful for the privilege of this work. Grateful for the people we've met. Grateful for the trust that has been placed in us." "And scared," Catherine added with characteristic honesty. "Change is always frightening, even when you know it's necessary." As they moved through the hospital, something beautiful began to happen. Staff members, patients, and families started following them, not in an intrusive way, but like people wanting to extend a moment of connection for as long as possible. By the time they reached the hospital's main atrium, a small crowd had gathered spontaneously. Dr. Matthews stepped forward with a microphone, her voice slightly trembling. "We wanted to say thank you," she began. "Not just for today, but for all the days. For the times you came when cameras weren't here. For the phone calls when we needed support for our programs. For treating our patients like the remarkable individuals they are." The crowd began to applaud, but it wasn't the polite, measured applause of official events. This was heartfelt appreciation from people whose work had been elevated and supported by royal attention. Catherine felt tears building behind her eyes and didn't try to stop them. William stepped forward to speak, but for a moment words seemed to fail him. He looked out at the faces surrounding them. Medical professionals who had dedicated their lives to healing children, families who had faced unimaginable challenges with grace, young patients who had shown courage beyond their years. "You have taught us more than we ever taught you," he finally said. "You have shown us what real service looks like, what true courage means, what love in action accomplishes." We may be ending our official roles, but we will never forget the lessons you've given us." As they prepared to leave, something unprecedented happened. Instead of the usual formal lineup for goodbyes, people began approaching them individually. A young nurse hugged Catherine and whispered, "You made me proud to do this work." A father whose child had been treated at the hospital shook William's hand and said, "You gave us hope when we needed it most." The formal protocol of royal visits dissolved into something much more human and real. For these final moments in their official capacity, they were simply people saying goodbye to other people who had mattered to each other. As they walked toward the hospital's main entrance for the final time, Catherine noticed that word had spread throughout the building. Windows on upper floors were filled with faces, patients in wheelchairs, medical students taking breaks from their studies, administrative staff who had left their desks to witness this moment. Some held phones to capture the scene, but many simply watched with quiet respect. The late afternoon sun streamed through the hospital's glass entrance, creating an almost ethereal backdrop as they stepped outside. The crowd that had gathered earlier had grown, but it remained remarkably peaceful. These weren't tourists or casual observers. These were people whose lives had intersected with William and Catherine's work in meaningful ways. Among the faces, Catherine spotted Mrs. Rodriguez, whose daughter had been born prematurely and spent months in this hospital's neonatal unit. Catherine had visited during those difficult early weeks, and now Mrs. Rodriguez stood with her healthy 4-year-old daughter, both of them holding flowers. "I never got to thank you properly," Mrs. Rodriguez called out as they approached. "Your visit gave us strength when we needed it most." The little girl, shy but determined, stepped forward and handed Catherine a single daisy. "Mama said you helped take care of me when I was tiny." Catherine knelt down, accepting the flower with the same gravity she would have shown for a state gift. "You've grown into such a beautiful, strong girl," she said. "Your mama must be very proud." As they continued their walkabout, similar scenes repeated themselves. Each interaction was brief but deeply personal. A teenage boy who had participated in one of William's youth programs presented him with a handmade certificate declaring him the best prince ever. An elderly woman who had met them at a community center opening pressed a small prayer card into Catherine's hand, whispering, "God bless you, dear." The media contingent following them had grown throughout the day, but something remarkable was happening. Instead of pushing for closer access or shouting questions, the photographers and journalists seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. They captured the scenes with respectful distance, allowing the genuine connections to unfold naturally. James Hartwell, a photographer who had documented their royal journey from engagement photos to this final day, lowered his camera for a moment and simply watched. Later, he would describe this as the most emotionally powerful assignment of his career, not because of dramatic events, but because of the authentic human connections he witnessed. As they neared the end of their walkabout, a group of student nurses appeared, having finished their shift and heard about the gathering. They had quickly organized themselves into a small choir and began singing Amazing Grace, a hymn that had been played at their wedding and had special meaning for both William and Catherine. The simple, unplanned serenade stopped conversation throughout the crowd. Catherine felt tears flowing freely now, no longer concerned about maintaining the composed public face that had been so carefully cultivated over the years. William's arm tightened around her waist, his own emotions clearly visible. When the song ended, the silence that followed was profound. In that moment, surrounded by people whose lives they had touched and who had touched theirs in return, the weight of what they were losing hit them both fully. This wasn't just about titles or positions. It was about losing a platform that had allowed them to make a real difference in people's lives. "Thank you," Catherine said, her voice carrying across the quiet crowd. "For everything. For trusting us with your stories, for letting us be part of your lives, for teaching us what real courage looks like." William stepped forward, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "This isn't goodbye," he said. "Our official roles may be ending, but our commitment to the causes we care about, our respect for the incredible work you all do, that will never end." As they began to move toward their waiting car, something beautiful and spontaneous occurred. The crowd began to applaud, but not in the formal way of official events. This was warm, sustained appreciation that seemed to come from a place of genuine affection and gratitude. Children waved from hospital windows above. Medical staff stood in doorways, many wiping away tears. Families who had met them over the years reached out to touch their hands one final time, as working royals. The security detail, usually focused on moving efficiently from point A to point B, seemed to understand that this moment needed to unfold at its own pace. They maintained their protective positions while allowing William and Catherine the time they needed to properly say goodbye. As they reached their car, Dr. Matthews appeared one final time with a special gift, a photo album documenting all their visits to the hospital over the years. Page after page showed them with patience, staff and families capturing moments of joy, comfort, and connection that had defined their public service. "So you never forget," she said simply, "that you made a difference." Catherine hugged the album close to her chest as they settled into the car for their final journey home as working royals. Through the window they could see the crowd slowly dispersing, but many people lingered as if reluctant to let the moment end completely. As their car pulled away, Catherine opened the photo album and found a handwritten note tucked inside the front cover. To William and Catherine, "You showed us that royalty isn't about titles or palaces. It's about caring for people and using whatever platform you have to make the world a little bit better. Thank you for being our examples of grace under pressure and love in action." The return journey to the palace took them through the heart of London, where word of their final engagement had spread through social media and news reports. Spontaneous gatherings had formed at various landmarks, people holding flowers outside Westminster Abbey where they had married, groups singing outside the hospital where their children were born, families with handmade signs gathered in the park where they had made countless public appearances. "Look at that," William said softly, pointing to a digital billboard in Piccadilly Circus that someone had managed to change to display a simple message. "Thank you, William and Catherine. London loves you." Catherine wiped fresh tears from her cheeks, overwhelmed by the unexpected outpouring of affection. They had prepared themselves for formal ceremonies and official farewells, but this grassroots response from ordinary people felt more meaningful than any state occasion could have been. Their driver, Robert, who had been with them for 7 years, caught their eyes in the rearview mirror. "Permission to speak freely, Your Royal Highnesses?" "Always, Robert," William replied. "It's been the greatest honor of my life to serve you both, not because of your titles, but because of who you are as people. You never forgot that all of us, security, drivers, staff, we're human beings with families and feelings. That meant everything." As they approached the palace gates, they could see that media crews from around the world had gathered for their final return. Satellite trucks lined the street, and reporters prepared for live broadcasts that would carry news of this transition to every corner of the globe. But before facing the international attention, they had one more private moment to navigate. The children were waiting in the entrance hall with their nanny, having been told that Mummy and Papa would be home for a special family dinner tonight. George ran to them immediately, his face bright with excitement about having his parents home earlier than usual. "Did you have a good day at work?" he asked innocently, the question hitting both William and Catherine with unexpected force. "Yes, sweetheart," Catherine managed, kneeling to hug her eldest son. "A very important day." Charlotte, always perceptive, studied their faces carefully. "You look different," she observed. "Sad but happy at the same time." "That's a very grown-up observation," William said, lifting his daughter into his arms. "Sometimes we can feel lots of different emotions all at once." Louis, the youngest, was more interested in the photo album Catherine still carried. "Pictures," he announced, reaching for it with the enthusiasm only a toddler could muster. They settled in the family sitting room, the children climbing onto their parents' laps as Catherine opened the album. Page by page they shared stories of their visits to the hospital, though they simplified the explanations for young ears. "Remember when we visited the children who were getting better from being sick?" Catherine asked, pointing to a photo of herself reading to patients in the pediatric ward. "Will we still visit them?" George asked. "We'll find ways to help them," William answered carefully. "Maybe not in exactly the same way, but we'll always care about making sure children who are sick get the best care possible." As evening fell, they shared what they knew would be their last family dinner in the palace dining room. The formal table had been set more casually than usual, and the atmosphere felt more like a treasured family meal than a royal obligation. Cook had prepared all their favorite foods, the children's beloved fish fingers alongside more sophisticated, dishes for the adults. Even this simple kindness from the palace kitchen staff felt loaded with meaning. Another small goodbye wrapped in the familiar. After dinner, they tucked the children into bed with extra stories and longer cuddles than usual. Each bedtime ritual felt precious, as if they were trying to store up enough love and normalcy to carry them through the uncertainty ahead. When the children were finally asleep, William and Catherine found themselves alone in their private quarters for the last time as working royals. In just a few hours, their official duties would end, and they would wake up to a completely different life. "I keep thinking about that little girl today," Catherine said, curled up beside William on their sofa. Emma, with her drawing of princesses and princes. She didn't care about constitutional crises or political pressures. She just saw two people who took time to listen to her. "Maybe that's what we should remember," William replied, stroking her hair. "Not the titles or the protocols or the pressures, just the connections, just the moments when we were able to make someone feel seen and valued." Outside their window, they could see lights from the media encampment, reminding them that the world was watching their transition. Tomorrow, newspapers around the globe would analyze their final day, dissect their emotions, and speculate about their future. But tonight, in the quiet of their private space, they were simply two people who had loved each other through an extraordinary journey and were now facing an uncertain but hopeful future together. "Do you think we'll miss it?" Catherine asked. William considered the question seriously. "I think we'll miss parts of it. The platform to help people, the ability to shine light on important causes, the incredible people we've met. But I won't miss the pressure, the constant scrutiny, the feeling that every decision has to be weighed against constitutional implications." They sat in comfortable silence, holding each other close as the clock ticked toward midnight and the official end of their royal careers. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight was for quiet reflection and gentle goodbye to the life that had defined them for over a decade. As the clock approached midnight, William and Catherine found themselves standing on the balcony of their private quarters, looking out over the palace grounds one final time as working royals. The night air was cool and crisp, carrying with it the sense of the gardens they had walked through that morning, which now felt like a lifetime ago. At 11:58 p.m., William's phone buzzed with a message from his father. "Proud of you both. This isn't an ending, it's a transformation. Love always." The simple words carried the weight of understanding and support that they hadn't been sure they would receive from the family that had watched them serve with such dedication. Catherine's phone showed messages from friends around the university, classmates, charity partners, people they had worked with over the years, all expressing love and support for whatever came next. The overwhelming response reminded them that their value as people extended far beyond their official roles. As midnight struck, something profound happened. There was no ceremonial bell, no official announcement, no dramatic moment marking the transition.
Instead, there was simply the quiet recognition that they were now William and Catherine Wales, private citizens, parents, and partners facing a future they would write for themselves. "How do you feel?"
Catherine whispered. "Free," William answered, surprising himself with the honesty of the response. Terrified, but free. The embrace that followed was captured by a single photographer who had positioned himself respectfully on a nearby rooftop. The image would become iconic, two people holding each other against the backdrop of a palace that had been their home and workplace, their faces reflecting both loss and hope, grief and possibility. In that embrace, viewers around the world saw something they hadn't expected. Instead of defeated figures retreating from public life, they saw two people who had found strength in each other, who had faced an impossible situation with grace, and who were stepping into uncertainty with courage. The photograph, taken without their knowledge but with artistic sensitivity, showed Catherine with her face pressed against William's shoulder. Her eyes closed, her expression peaceful despite the tears on her cheeks. William's arms were wrapped protectively around her, his chin resting on her head, his own eyes looking toward a horizon they couldn't yet see clearly. The moment lasted only seconds, but in those seconds something beautiful was revealed. Their love had sustained them through the pressures of royal life, and it would sustain them through whatever came next. They had faced this transition not as isolated individuals bearing impossible burdens, but as partners who had chosen to carry their challenges together. When they finally separated, Catherine laughed softly through her tears. "We did it," she said. "We actually did it. We served with honor, we loved our people well, and now we get to find out who we are without the titles." "I know who we are," William replied, taking her hands. "We're the parents of 3 amazing children. We're people who care deeply about making the world better. We're individuals who have learned that service comes in many forms, and we're partners who can face anything together." The next morning brought something they hadn't experienced in over a decade, waking up without a schedule determined by others. There were no briefings waiting, no red boxes to review, no carefully planned appearances requiring their attention. Instead, there was the sound of their children laughing in the next room, the smell of coffee from a kitchen where they could now choose their own breakfast, and the possibility of walking out their front door without coordinating with multiple security teams. The first few weeks were challenging in ways they hadn't anticipated. The sudden absence of structure and constant purpose left them feeling somewhat lost, but gradually, they began to discover the freedom that came with being able to choose their own priorities. Catherine returned to photography with a passion that surprised her, documenting real families, real stories, real moments of grace in ordinary lives. Her work began to appear in galleries and magazines, valued for its artistic merit rather than the celebrity of its creator. William threw himself into conservation work with organizations that welcomed his expertise and passion rather than his title. He spent weeks in the field, working alongside scientists and researchers, contributing knowledge and effort rather than just royal patronage. Most importantly, they discovered that their capacity to make a difference hadn't disappeared with their titles. If anything, their freedom from protocol allowed them to engage more authentically with the causes they cared about. The image of their midnight embrace became a symbol of grace under pressure, of love sustaining people through impossible circumstances, of the truth that sometimes the most beautiful moments emerge from the most difficult transitions. Years later, when people remembered this time, they wouldn't primarily recall the constitutional crisis or the political pressures that had forced these changes. Instead, they would remember the dignity with which William and Catherine had faced their transition, the genuine love they had shown for the people they served, and the courage they had demonstrated in stepping into an uncertain future together. Their story became proof that endings could indeed be beginnings, that love could sustain people through unimaginable changes, and that sometimes the most profound service comes not from holding on to titles and positions, but from having the wisdom and courage to let them go when the time is right. In their final moment as working royals, captured in that tender embrace against the backdrop of a palace they were leaving behind, William and Catherine had shown the world what grace looks like when everything you thought you knew about your life changes overnight. They had demonstrated that true nobility comes not from birth or title, but from how we treat each other when everything else falls away.